Good evening and welcome to our event. I am Mario Peraza, Executive Director of Alumni Relations. Tonight is the first in our ongoing series, Alumni Author Conversations. This will be a bi-monthly series highlighting recently published UCSF alumni authors and their books. If you have any recommendations for other authors we might bring to this series, just email alumni@ucsf.edu. Before I introduce our host this evening, I want to review a few logistics. If you have any technology issues, please email alumni@ucsf.edu and we'll get back to you and try to help solve any issues you might be having. And we also will be saving around 10 to 15 minutes at the end for any questions you have. So if you have any questions for our speakers this evening, please use the chat function of Zoom and we'll monitor this and we'll send it on to our speakers. Now, I am pleased to introduce our host for the evening, Dr. Charles Irwin. Dr. Irwin came to UCSF as a medical student in 1969 and has remained here for his entire career. Currently, he is a distinguished professor of pediatrics, the director of the Division of Adolescents and Young Adult Medicine, and the director of health policy in the Department of Pediatrics at UCSF and at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital. His research has focused on understanding the biological and social predictors of risk-taking in adolescents and how clinicians can use these predictors in their practices. Currently, his health services research programs emphasis is on improving preventive screening practices in clinical settings and the financial structural issues altering adolescents and young adults' ability to access healthcare in the United States. Please welcome Dr. Charles Irwin.
Oh, thank you, Mario, for introducing me. And I want to thank the UCSF staff for organizing this event and for all of you who've joined us tonight. I'm really fortunate to begin this conversation with Dr. Barbara Horowitz. Dr. Horowitz is a UCSF alumna from the School of Medicine in the class of 1987. She's a cardiologist and evolutionary biologist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School, Harvard University's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, and the Division of Cardiology at UCLA. Her research focuses on the natural world as a source of insights into human pathology and developmental challenges. Her New York Times bestseller, Zubiquity, has received several awards and was a finalist in the American Association for the Advancement of Science Excellence in Science Books Award, a Smithsonian Top Book of 2012, and a Discover Magazine Book of the Year. It has been translated into 7 languages and has been used as a common read at the universities across the country. Her latest book, Wildhood, uses the lens of evolutionary biology, neuroscience, and animal behavior to better understand the species-spanning challenges of growing up. And tonight we shall be focusing on Wildhood, which is written by Dr. Horowitz and her co-author, Ms. Bowers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Barbara Horowitz.
Thank you, Charlie and Mario, and I'd like to echo the gratitude to the UCSF staff and to setting this up, and I'm really honored to be kicking this series off, so just delighted to be here. Well, Charlie, go ahead.
Go ahead, no. Before we begin this, to take questions from our audience, I was really very interested as I was reading this book over the past couple of weeks. You really tackled a very complex area of animal and human development through the lens of a physician with training in both medicine and psychiatry. And so I was interested in what led you to write a book like Wildhood. And can you give our audience what maybe some of the messages or what led to this important discovery that took you on?
Yeah, I would be delighted to, and I think probably the best way to do it is with a few slides, no words, all pictures and videos. So with your permission, let me get that. So just to give you a little bit of background, I am a cardiologist and I also trained as a psychiatrist, but I now work as an evolutionary biologist, and I teach, I write, I do research. And when I teach, I tell my students the first day of class, I say, I would like for you to check your human exceptionalism at the door. And I say that because I've come to believe that human exceptionalism, which we can talk about a little bit more later, it's a blindfold. And it is a blindfold that prevents us from recognizing connections that can help us better understand ourselves. So with that, I will launch in and tell you that I finished UCSF. I came back home to Los Angeles. I trained at the NPI in psychiatry. I was chief resident in psychiatry there. And then I trained in internal medicine, was chief resident in internal medicine. And then I did a cardiology fellowship and spent the next, a decade and a half, happily on faculty at UCLA. And I was doing a lot of imaging. And one day I got a telephone call from one of the veterinarians at the Los Angeles Zoo. And that really was a telephone call that changed my life. So they had a chimpanzee who they thought had a neurological event, and they wanted me to perform a transesophageal echo. This is actually a great ape. This is a gorilla. But I came and I did the procedure, and then a few weeks later they called me to screen a gorilla for aortic dissection, which is a cause of death in some gorillas, and so on and so forth. This was actually the chimpanzee. And just to show, since we have human health professionals here, this was the first time I'd ever done a TEE on a non-human animal. The patient was intubated, and it was very similar, of course. But what I saw was really surprising at that time. I dropped the probe, and this is what I saw. And as you can appreciate, there's the left ventricle and the right ventricle, a left atrium and a right atrium. And it's hard to not see these thrombi, multiple thrombi in the right atrium. And it turned out Pandora had blood clots in both her left and right atrium. But what struck me as I looked at that echo that day was how remarkably similar it was to the echocardiogram of a human patient that I'd done some weeks earlier. And that really was the spark. It turned out the patient had a restrictive cardiomyopathy, and in all of the years that I had been taking care of patients with that disorder, teaching about it, it had never really occurred to me what other animals might spontaneously develop the problem. So when I finished medical school, what I believed the connection between human and animal health was twofold. One, zoonotic diseases, and second was the important role of animals in laboratory investigation. But I really did not think about animal diseases per se. But it was at the zoo that I actually first learned about cardiovascular disease in great apes and other primates, a range of cancers, including, this is an example that I found absolutely fascinating, the increased rate of breast cancer among captive big cats. Jaguars are one example, and in some cases, the reasons are parallel some of the human reasons. And in fact, this is one of my favorite pictures. This was a picture of Cookie. She was an elderly lioness at the LA Zoo, and they called because she was in respiratory distress. She ended up having about 700 cc's of pericardial fluid, which we drained, and she did very well. It turned out not to be metastatic breast cancer, a metastatic fusion, but that was where I first learned about this breast cancer association. So I was learning about heart disease in other animals and cancer in other animals and orthopedic issues and reproductive issues. And it was really transformational for me because it really had not been on my radar at all. And during that period of time, I'm condensing about 7 years, but I also really for the first time, despite having done a residency in psychiatry, I really knew nothing about comparative psychopathology. But it didn't take very long when you spend time with veterinarians, and I started going to vet conferences and reading a lot and lecturing and just learning that, of course, psychopathology is not unique to humans. And I started learning about a pretty wide range of disorders, including compulsive disorders, the whole world of canine genomics and vulnerability to some psychopathology, within species, that is within, Canis familiaris, but even certain kinds of, this is a pacing compulsion that's seen in bears and some big cats, etc. So I was really having this absolutely, my mind was being opened to something I hadn't thought about before. This is actually a picture, an avian correlate to trichotillomania. It's called feather plucking disorder. And all of this was really the subject of the first book, Ubiquity, which Catherine Bowers and I researched and wrote over about 5 years. Well, during the period that Catherine and I were working on this, we realized, and this is already now, quite a few years ago, that there wasn't a lot of information in some areas. You know, Rudolf Virchow, who we all consider one of the, you know, he's the father of modern pathology and one of the fathers of medicine, you know, he got it, right? So he wrote in the 19th century, between animal and human medicine, there's no dividing line, nor should there be. The object is different, but the experience obtained constitutes the basis of medicine. And yet, many physicians, it has been my experience, have incomplete knowledge of animal pathology, and that's unfortunate. So as over this was coming up on 8 or 9 years, as I was really shifting what I was doing from practicing clinical cardiology and teaching to starting a program in evolutionary medicine at UCLA, and doing research looking for comparative insights into a range of human health concerns, I was also looking for a methodology, a way to systematically take the information that I was getting about the diseases of other animals and find a way to use that information to better understand human health. And I found the solution actually in the work of Nico Tinbergen, who was a Nobel Prize winner in medicine and physiology in 1973. He was an animal behaviorist. He was an ornithologist, and he studied fish and birds. But Tinbergen had this insight, which was really, really genius and has very much influenced me. Tinbergen recognized that when scientists answer the question why, they typically give a very mechanistic, what he called a proximate answer. I know that when someone would ask me, well, why did my husband have a heart attack? I would give an answer that had to do with atherosclerosis and a plaque, or maybe a blood clot. Quite mechanistic. What Tinbergen recognized is to really understand why, one had to consider the evolutionary context. In other words, not what happened in the lifetime of that individual animal, but rather what were the evolutionary pressures that shaped vulnerability to that trait. And so that is essentially what I used. I'm, again, condensing something long into something very, very short. But this is an example of the kind of phylogenies that I started to build. Tinbergen said to answer the question why, you needed to look across species. You needed to create phylogenies, which, as you know, are these models that are used by evolutionary biologists to show the relationship between species. And this is the most famous phylogeny. This was Darwin's, the only illustration of the origin of species. This was his kind of thinking about it. And of course, you gotta love that humility, I think. But the methodology that I used involved systematic review, phylogenetic analyses, with the goal of saying, can we use comparative approaches to understand something in human medicine that's puzzling? And so let me just give you one very quick medical example of the methodology, and then I'll quickly introduce some of the ways in which you can apply that methodology to understanding why adolescence is so dangerous, why there's so much emotional upheaval during the period, why sexual development and sexual experiences can be problematic, and then the road to independence, why that can be challenging. So this is an example of how I've applied this methodology to the question of vasovagal syncope. All right, so why do people, human beings, sometimes faint when they're scared, right? So all of us know, if you were asked why does vasovagal syncope occur, you might give an answer, well, depending on how mechanistic you want to be, so you say, well, there's a paradoxical bradycardia in response to some high adrenergic experience, right? And in fact, I know that I have said that before, that fear, one would expect to cause a tachycardia, except in vasodepressive syncope and vasovagal syncope, we see the opposite. Now, it seems paradoxical, but only if you have a Homo sapiens-centric lens. As you broaden your view and widen the phylogenetic range of animals in whom you're looking at it, it becomes less paradoxical. So that's essentially what I did. And it turns out fear bradycardia, there are many names for it in the veterinary and wildlife literature, but the phenomenon of a vertebrate animal being scared and having a bradycardia is found across chordates. It's seen from fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and other mammals. And here's an example of the kinds of papers that I would find as I started to use, a range of nomenclature to capture these studies that were looking at something else, but really brought in that information. So there were a series of studies that looked at young deer. This is a fawn, right? Beautiful young deer. And they put telemetry, they did EKG leads, and then the scientists played recordings of wolf howls, and the heart rate went from about 200 or so down, really plummeted, and boom, this is what you see. And of course, what's happening with this animal is, I can't know for sure that this is a syncopal episode, but there does appear to be a loss of motor tone. And as a functional effect, the animal's quiet. She is acoustically, at least, hidden from predators. And it turns out stillness, immobility, is seen across chordates and invertebrates as a survival response, an anti-predation response. This is a different mechanism, but I love this. There you go. These are juvenile mongoose who are also using tonic immobility as a fear reflex. So you begin to see this, how something that looks paradoxical all of a sudden takes on a very different meaning when you have the context of phylogeny and evolution. One thing to consider, Charlie, is that, our species, we've been on Earth for about 200,000 years. Homo sapiens emerged more or less. Some people say a little bit before that, but let's say 200,000 years. And mammals maybe at 200 million years. Of course, we share a vast amount of autonomic physiology with other mammals. We've got reptiles at about 500 or so, 500 million years, and we still share so much physiology with reptiles, with fish, fish at 500 or so. So, we retain a lot of physiology that is maybe no longer adaptive, right? There's a mismatch between what our modern lives demand and what we're experiencing and the physiology that we walk around with. And sometimes that lens can allow us to understand why in a more expanded way. By the way, one of my favorite things is analogies is that if you think of the Earth was, the beginning of Earth at about 4.5 billion. If the history of Earth was a trip by an airplane trip from LAX to JFK, right? So across the country. So that's the beginning of the Earth. We humans would not appear until about 570 feet before touchdown at the airport. So we are really new arrivals. So can this lens be applied to adolescents? To your question, the answer is that's what Catherine and I were really interested in doing. And it was challenging. At first we were told, well, there's no such thing as animal adolescence, but it turned out that is definitely not the case. Adolescence is not created by human beings, by modern cultures. There's many ways of looking at adolescence and culture, of course. But we started asking questions about risk-taking and danger, because one of our big concerns initially was, can we better understand why teenagers take risks and have an elevated mortality, why it's so dangerous. And very quickly, we quickly saw that in a wide range of other species, their impulsivity coupled with inexperience that results in higher rates of roadkill. Road-killed animals are more likely to be adolescents. Whale-striped whales are, again, more likely to be adolescents out on their own than older, more experienced whales, or younger calves who are being supervised and directed by mom. And some of the characteristics of adolescent behavior in the wild are shared by our own teenagers, including interest in new things, neophilia, decreased threshold for risk-taking, and that is important to promote the exploration and the dispersal that's necessary for independence. But on the other hand, of course, the combination of being big enough to leave a mother or home, but lacking experience, that combination, it can be, you know, really very deadly. And one other factor, just I will point out, and I'll end in a second, is that in nature, we see that adolescent animals, their predator naivete is known to the predators themselves who target them. We were able to find, and we put in the book, several really interesting examples of predators, including this ecotype of orca that actually specializes in adolescents. So I could show you video of adolescent animals doing really, you know, both scary and adorable things. And, you know, we love them, but we also, they make us insane, for those of you who've had adolescents. But the fact of the matter is, these adolescent wildebeests are jumping in the water at the Mara River because they're hot and it just looks so good. But you'll notice that they're older, the older members of the group are not so quick to jump in. And that is the essence of it. Of course, there are crocodiles in those rivers. So inexperience, underestimating risk, is a characteristic of adolescent animals across. We found evidence for this from fish through humans. And the real question is how to gain experience and not get yourself hurt badly or killed. One of the things that they do, adolescents do, is they come together in groups and they inspect their predators. On the left, this is a group of meerkats who are encircling a Cape Cobra. And you can see that it's dangerous, but they're doing it, they're learning. And that's called predator inspection. And it's an adaptation that can help us understand risk-taking in our own kids. And I'll explain that later. But this is another example. These are actually Thompson gazelle. These are adolescents, and they are coming toward and inspecting. Look at these 3 cheetah, right? These are one of their top predators. And yet predator inspection in this species is well known. And here is the key point. It's a safety behavior. The predator inspection is dangerous up front, but the more information the Thompson gazelle adolescents has about the details about the predator, how they hunt, what they look like, what they smell, ultimately that information is going to keep them safer. So that was, that's one piece of it. We ended up identifying 4, this is one of my favorite of all adolescent animal videos. This is a king penguin, South Georgia Island, right? Still has the baby brown juvenile plumage, isn't quite mature. But we found that there are 4 core competencies that every adolescent needs to go through in order to become an adult. And those competencies, let me go off share here, are safety. A juvenile animal needs to learn how to keep themselves safe. They need to learn how to negotiate status hierarchies. And social animals, from fish through birds through mammals, you know, where an individual is in the status hierarchy is very determinative of their destiny, and we can talk about that. So status is number 2. The third, they need to learn about sex. And we really emphasize not doing sex, having sex, because it turns out copulation is easy, but courtship is hard. And it can take many animals, wild animal species, a very long time to learn to communicate sexually, which is what courtship is, to understand, to recognize their own desire and restraint. And this is a conversation that, you know, could not be more timely for modern adolescents. And then the final core competency is self-reliance, is learning, essentially learning how to feed yourself. And that is something that also can take a long time. And I'll end with this sort of interesting thought that when we think about the dangers to animals in the wild, we usually think of predation, but starvation, not being able to find your resources and take care of yourself in that sense, is actually a more significant cause of death for wild animals. So we found many parallels. We found many differences as well, but that is that's sort of the short history of how this all came to be.
So Barbara, there have been some questions submitted earlier, and one of the questions that people are asking, how does this book, Wildhood, really help parents or helps people like myself, pediatricians, caring for adolescents to better understand them and work with them in a meaningful way and support their families and allow them to take risks and not end up, dead on the highway through an automobile accident.
Yeah, I mean, it's I mean, my own kids were kind of on the tail end of adolescence when, well, depending on who you ask, maybe they're still in adolescence. But there are quite a few things that happened, and Catherine's kids were younger, a little bit younger. We were going through this. So just a couple of examples. They're more in the book, but probably the biggest thing is that adolescence has been pathologized. It has been turned into a disease. There is a disease, I say air quotes. People, I mean, I just did it, right? There's like hand wringing about, oh, teenagers, you hear people saying, oh, your toddlers are so cute. Oh, wait till they're teenagers. It's become this kind of dreaded, really pathologized period. And I think that one thing is it's normalizing. To the extent that that can be helpful for parents, it's ancient, first of all. There's a lot that can go wrong, but usually it doesn't. And I think that there's a lot we can learn about the adaptations, the evolved adaptations of other species to keep adolescent animals safe. There are some fascinating, we write about the risk of sexual coercion, for example, in adolescent animals. And there's some really interesting adaptations that, we're not going to do exactly what that animal did in humans, but it informs us about the range of strategies, the kind of bio-inspired solutions. The other piece of it is that I think it can make us more tolerant. One really interesting, this is not wild animals, it's domestic animals, but so between 8 months and about 2 years, depending on the dog breed, that's considered canine adolescence. And canine adolescence is the highest risk period for a dog to be relinquished to a shelter. So in other words, a family has a puppy. And yeah, the puppy is, rambunctious and isn't well disciplined, but so adorable. But then they have puppy license, right? But then they get bigger. And what happens during canine adolescence is you have this mismatch between a big body and an immaturity. And so canine adolescents are louder, they push boundaries, they can be hypersexual, and people don't like it. And so it's during this period that they're at risk for being relinquished, which in many states equals euthanasia. And what is interesting, what I learned is that, really it is a developmental period. If you talk to people who know a lot about dogs, they explain that it's a wonderful period for training. That there's this, the neurobiology of canine adolescence. It's the perfect time to really train. But if you don't recognize it as a period that's a normal developmental, stressful, challenging, maybe unpleasant period, you can do things you might regret. We don't return our adolescent kids, I hope to, that's not what happens. But I think there's a way of being more compassionate and understanding and maybe a little bit more empathic.
We're also getting lots of questions from families about how can I cope with this COVID pandemic? Suddenly, parents, young people are back together. And are there any examples in the animal world that would be kind of similar to the pandemic that we're experiencing right now, the fires, the people losing their homes, needing to join with other families living together? So it'd just be helpful, I think, for us to hear about what you've learned from the animal world.
Yeah, so I don't think I have any specific solutions, but there's some really, I find interesting parallels. One, there's a neurobiology, a bird neurobiology, it's called Zuganru, and it's usually referred to the pre-migration change in brain function and behavior. And it's the bird, they sort of right before they go off to migrate, they are kind of fidgety and they tend to fight more. There's more conflict in the nest. And it turns out there's a pre-dispersal Zuganru as well. That is, before a bird leaves, there's a term which we use as a surrogate for a bird adolescent, which is a fledge, right? So in a nest, you've got the eggs, and then you have nestlings, which are the little babies. A fledgling bird is a bird that's physically big enough to literally leave the nest. Now they're inexperienced, and we found that they're at high risk during those first days and weeks. But there's a neurobiology of birds that during that period before they're going to leave, they have more conflict with their parents. And I have some wonderful video. I have so much great video, but they fight with their parents more. And it's an adaptive, it's probably adaptive to facilitate dispersal. And there's this wonderful eagle species, the Spanish imperial eagle. And, some birds encourage their young adult offspring to actually stay in the nest and help. It's called helper at the nest, but others encourage dispersal. And the Spanish imperial eagle moms, they have to do something, it's called parental meanness. This is the word in scientific literature, where they put their talon together like a club and they thunk them to literally get them out. The point is that if a bird is supposed to disperse developmentally and they don't, that Zuganru, that conflict, one could imagine there would be no pop-off valve for it. So when I'm hearing from my friends in all kinds of places about fighting in the context of quarantine and all of that, that is just an interesting parallel for me. On the other hand, there's a fascinating something called extended parental care. So in many cultures around the world, and actually many cultures here in the US, young adult offspring stay with their parents. It's not an uncommon pattern. But as you know, after World War II, when America's economy was such that people could graduate from high school and get a job, and off they went. And so there was this kind of idea that, well, you go to college and then you don't come back home. Well, we know that that's not the case anymore. Well, it turns out extended parental care is seen in animals. The Gentoo penguin, the Galapagos penguin are two examples. When the environment is not conducive to a young adult making it, finding enough food, if it's dangerous, they will come back even after they've fledged, even after they've left. They'll come back for extended parental care. And this is an example of the flexibility in parenting that we see in nature. That there isn't one way of doing it. And even within the same species, you see different strategies depending on what's happening. And you even see different strategies, parental strategies, depending on the individual characteristics of the bird, of the child, of the offspring. So if there's a note that we can take from the natural world about coping with quarantine, and I think one is that flexibility, paying attention to what's happening in the environment, being very nimble, and just not being locked into one way of doing it.
That's helpful. There's a couple of questions around the issue of what are the implications of your work for ethnic and racial groups impacted by different environmental factors, and clearly we are having some really pretty overwhelming issues that we're confronting now in the United States around race and racism and systematic racism. So I'd be interested in, is there something that looks at the environment that would be helpful to understand what the implications of this might be?
Yes, one of the big surprises, and there are many, when you research a book, you just learn, and it's such a wonderful moment when you just go down these wormholes. Well, I really I'd never given much thought to the idea of privilege outside of human culture. I thought about concerns related to privilege in the context of race, in the context of socioeconomic status, etc. And Catherine and I learned some really interesting things about what factors really shape the destinies of young of young animals on planet Earth, including us. And one very important factor is where you're born, what the resources are, and how dangerous it is. That is more determinative in many ways than many other individual factors. So there are two examples. We studied two populations of spotted hyenas, one in the Ngorongoro crater in Tanzania, and the other in the Serengeti, which is nearby. And it's the same species, but the Ngorongoro crater is much lusher. There's much more prey. There's about 219 prey items per square kilometer in Ngorongoro, whereas in the Serengeti, it's about 3.3 prey items per square kilometer. And so, even before an individual there's the chances of a good outcome, let's say, already just stacked against. The environment itself shapes that. Add to that predator, how dangerous an environment is again going to really be shaping destinies. So resources and danger, the environment is, as a universal principle, I'm not overstating it, we should be looking at first. I mean, when we think about public health versus personalized medicine, environment is critical. The second, the other example, we went up to Prince Albert National Park in Canada, in Saskatchewan. We were tracking adolescent bison. And one of the things we learned is that, the winters are very harsh there. There are lots of predators compared to bison in Yellowstone. And again, you see this, the privileged bison, in essence, those that have advantages that they're born into, that really influence their destiny. Add to that some really fascinating research. I use the example of the spotted hyena, so I'll continue with that. Some animals spotted hyena society is very there's a rigid status hierarchy. It's a female dominant society. And the high-ranking mother, her cubs, particularly her females, are high-ranking. And there are all these advantages that happen just based on that. So her pregnancy, she's going to have access to more food, higher quality food and meat. As a consequence, her cubs that are gestating are going to be born larger and healthier. The lactation environment is going to be better, the milk, the quality. They have a faster weaning, which allows them to then support themselves with meat. I mean, and this builds, and they continue to have one advantage after another. The physical advantage leads to a greater likelihood that they'll win contests, that keeps them at a higher, and this happens not just within one lifetime, it happens across generations. We found evidence of territory inheritance and resource inheritance in many species, suggesting that some individuals are advantaged more than others. We found evidence of intervention by parents to aid offspring in contests, this sort of thing. Why is this important? Well, right now we are, as a society, struggling with so many things, but a very central question is how can we make decisions to create more equality and greater opportunity for everyone? And I would say that in order to find solutions that are truly effective, we have to truly understand what we're dealing with. And for us to not understand how embedded privilege is in our lives and this ancient legacy is to trivialize it. And if you trivialize a problem, then the solutions that you come up with are going to be equally trivial. So I think there's a real opportunity to begin to rethink how we understand and think about the advantages and the absence of level playing fields in nature. There's a wonderful paper, we write about this in the work that we did in Wildhood, but Jenny Tung and Noah Snyder-Macklin in Science in May published an article called The Social Determinants of Health in Humans and Other Animals, which I would highly recommend, and it really kind of makes this point very, very well.
So there's one thing that I was intrigued with is that Is there anything that is really unique to animal culture or unique to the humans that doesn't overlap? Because so much of the book, as I was reading it, this sounds so familiar to what I see in adolescents, young adults, but I was also imagining there must be things that are uniquely human and uniquely animal.
Yeah, it's funny. I grew up in a home. We weren't animal people at all. My parents say that we had a pet, but I don't actually remember it. So yeah, I'm not coming from that perspective. But I do remember when I was in 7th grade, we were reading George Orwell's Animal Farm, and I learned the word anthropomorphism. And I was taught that it was a very foolish thing to do, and it was the projection of human characteristics onto animals. And it was a foolish thing to do because we humans are so unique that it was, that it's ludicrous to do that. Well, what I've learned since then is that I've learned quite a lot. Number one, actually the definition of anthropomorphism is the projection of human characteristic onto an animal in a way that isn't scientifically justifiable. And since the 1970s, gulp, you already said what year I graduated from medical school, so I think my age is already out there. But since the 1970s, we have the field of comparative genomics is showing us exactly how connected we are on a genomic level with other animals. Then, 99, 90, 60. We have molecular phylogenetics, which can pinpoint our common ancestor with other species. And we've got neuroscience and neuroimaging, which is showing us similar neuroanatomical regions and functions. So today, I would argue that if there's a scientific error to be made, it isn't anthropomorphism, rather it's the human exceptionalism that underlies anthropomorphism, and that human exceptionalism is a blindfold. So having said that, of course there are some things that are unique to many characteristics that are unique to our species, because the definition of a species includes unique features. It's like baked into the definition. Every species has unique characteristics. We are not uniquely unique. So when it comes to in ubiquity, we were looking for, well, what are the diseases that are uniquely human? And there are a few conditions that have not been consistently identified in other species, so there are those. In the case of human adolescents, I think that there are, obviously there are culturally unique characteristics. I think one really interesting moment for us is to look at how our brains are changing in this, in this virtual, in this adolescence that our kids have now, which is both in real life and also in the virtual world. And that is not just a challenge, it's a challenge that's modifying who we are. So that is certainly unique, but most, because there's been such a kind of a fetish almost for so long with what makes us human, what makes us unique. I am honestly much less interested in that, that piece of it, although it's important, than the much larger, overlooked, rich source of insights that can be gained by, responsibly and scientifically identifying the points of commonality.
So one of the things you do talk about in the prologue, I remember, and you just kind of mentioned it, but these two worlds that adolescents in our culture, in human world right now, there's two ways to adulthood. There's the real life communities that they need to experience, but there's also this digital world that parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents don't have the experience in. It's a unique experience to them. So I think that's maybe one of the boundaries right now that creates a fair amount of conflict between families. And how do I provide safety with my young person spending 80% of his or her life on the internet? And how do I, when I walk into the room, they've got something on that I can't believe that's on there. What do I do with this? These kinds of issues that I think probably 20 years ago we didn't have to deal with.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's really an upheaval of the kind of the traditional idea that adolescents are predator naive, but that they get parental support if they're, you know, birds or mammals with that kind of parental care that makes them safer. And now we have this world, this environment where they know more than very often than their parents do, which actually makes them predator naive. And so I think what a parent can do in a way, I mean, it's been very helpful for me in doing this research and learning about the concept of what does it mean to be predator naive? You know, there's big literature in wildlife about what that means and what animals do to become less predator naive. One of the things that that's very important, and we actually cover in the book, is the predator sequence. So there's a 4-stage sequence that between a predator sort of seeing a potential meal and actually killing goes through, and it is it's replicated from across vertebrates, and you also see it in invertebrate predators. So I think knowing your predator, knowing the predatory sequence, is probably useful, a useful guide to give your kids. Because there are predators, of course, you know, in the early days of the internet, I feel like that was what most parents were largely concerned about. I think there are an expanded set of concerns now, but that predator sequence does apply to, I think, sexual predators and others who are targeting easy prey, who are predator naive, who don't recognize the danger, who are going to fall for it, essentially.
So there's a question that's coming from the audience, and they're about adolescent animals and how do they interact with their elderly members? Do they get the sense that as humans, the adolescents are less respectful and more individualist and rebellious? Is that a similar kind of phenomena that we see with animals? Or and do adolescent animals care for the elderly as they get older, or do they not?
So the latter question, I cannot think of it's a great question. I can't honestly think of an example that off the top of my head of an adolescent animal caring for an older animal. I mean, we know, of course, the orcas, the non-migrating orcas who have, you know, the females have decades of post-reproductive life, and a lot of that has to do with protecting the offspring while the mother is off hunting, but that's not an adolescent. There is more conflict between adolescents and their parents, as I said before they go. I mean, there are not all species do adolescents leave the home, right? And in some species, the males leave, and some the females leave. In some they both leave. Sometimes they leave alone. Sometimes they leave together. Sometimes one season one leaves and the other doesn't. So there's a lot of flexibility and variation. But the question is really, I love it because it speaks to the individuality of animals. And again, I am the first to say that I was extremely ignorant. I was highly educated and really ignorant at the same time about the natural world. And one of my points of ignorance is I would look at a flock of birds or a school of fish. I love that collective animal behavior, all that the murmurations of the starlings. But I would think of it as sort of a bunch of clones, if I thought of it at all. I really didn't think about individuality. And that has really completely shifted for me. When I see birds flying by, I know that some of them have higher status, social status than others. Some of them are male, some are female. Some have a health status that's different than others. Many of them have had different experiences. Some have had traumatic experiences, which have modified their behavior. We know from the first book we looked at wallabies who jumped into these poppy fields in Tasmania, which has, you know, some of these large, you know, medical opium poppy fields, and some of the wallabies would jump in and would, you know, couldn't get enough of the poppy sap and straw, kind of get, you know, intoxicated. They would get intoxicated, and they wouldn't leave. And others would go in, they might try it, they'd leave. So, you know, why? So when I now look at animals, I think about them as individuals with different temperaments. By the way, different neurodiversity. That's a whole other field that I've been really interested in. And so they're going to relate to each other in different ways. Again, I don't know about the elderly, about how they treat elderly, and there's lots of variation anyway.
There was also a question that that came up that about adolescents hanging out in groups versus alone, and there's some discussions. Is it safer when adolescents hang out together, or do they get into more trouble than if they're alone? And what I was hearing from you earlier is that with some of the sea otters, the otters who go into territories, I don't know if they singularly go in, or do they go in as a group and get into danger, or is one safer than a group of them together?
Right. So yeah, I was sharing with you, we were talking about this story that the California sea otter, there's a population of them near Moss Landing, near the Monterey the aquarium, and they the ocean that right outside of their cove there are a lot of great white sharks. It's actually, they call it the triangle of death. I mean, there's so many sharks. And the mature sea otter don't go into the triangle of death, and neither do the young ones who are with the parents, but the adolescents do. And it's they're the sort of they're probably predator inspecting, similar behavior you saw in the Thompson gazelle and the meerkat. So they go in and and sometimes they get hurt. Whether they do it in groups or not, I don't know. But predator inspection is usually done in groups, very often with other individuals. And that is probably because there's safety in numbers. Interestingly, this behavior of a group of meerkats or a group of, I've seen it with river otter, inspecting a jaguar. They are also they're like linking arms, sort of safety in numbers, and they may try to intimidate the predator, almost taunt the predator. So, but groups are really interesting. So before I even thought about any of this stuff, I thought of peer pressure as something like bad. Like if I had to do that, good or bad, I'd be like peer pressure bad. And I've completely flipped on that, having written this book. So there's a huge amount of safety behavior that you can only get from peers. And there are two examples. There's a lot of information you can only get from peers that's not even about safety. For example, fish, if you isolate a schooling fish, they never really get the hang of schooling properly. Like their tail beat frequency won't quite be right. They will suffer from something called the oddity effect, which creates a series of other problems. But the other point is that that safety behavior, you need to learn from your peers. And one of the number one way, the best way to learn about safety is not the best way in my book, but is a near-miss personal experience. If you have a near-miss personal experience, that safety learning is going to stick. So what's the next best way? Well, one of the next best ways is hanging around peers who have had experience with predators. And there's a wonderful natural experiment that was done. So when you go to a restaurant and you order salmon, and there's wild caught and there's farmed salmon, and you kind of figure out, which one should I have? Well, there's a difference you might not have known about. So the farmed salmon are during, early in their development, they're kept in a netted environment and they're protected from predators. So they are very predator naive when they're let out into the ocean for a prolonged period of time where they grow before they come back. In fact, in one of the studies in this, I believe it was a Swedish fish farm, predators were waiting for these farmed salmon, right? These smolts. A smolt is an adolescent salmon, right? There's wonderful words. An elver is an adolescent eel. But the predators were waiting. So what did they do? Well, they realized that the wild smolt, those adolescents who had, in their early years, they'd been around predators, they were much safer. They knew how to move, and so they started bringing their naive, not so sea smart farm salmon in with wild smolts. And it helped a lot. Just being with more experienced peers was positive. Now, there are some negative things about peers. There's exploitation. In the animal kingdom, we see a fair amount of exploitation of bigger peers and older peers, of younger. Sometimes it's resource-based, sometimes it's sexual exploitation. But there are a tremendous number of advantages and huge positives that animals learn from peers. And my favorite, one of my favorite stories is is learning bird song. So, you know, a bird has to be around peers to learn the right pitch, the right cadence, there's a lot of complexity to many bird song. You know, there's many of the characteristics that we see in human music. And there are even accents, right, from one region to another. And if a bird is isolated during this period of development of language acquisition, and even in the period where they're honing it, they can never really get it quite right. And that's a bad thing, but that could be a catastrophe, because it turns out in some species, for example, one species of canary, when a male really knows how to do the song right and is able to sing with the exact, it's called the French researchers called it the sexy syllables, that it can induce female ovulation. But if you're not with your peers, if you're not talking the talk, if you're not really learning the culture, you're learning the moves, you may never learn those sexy syllables. So there's lots of advantages to peer exposure.
Well, we're going to have to end the conversation. I was wondering if you had any other helpful pointers for all of us who feel like we'd like to pick your mind for about 3 more hours.
You know, I mean, it's just a little bit of an invitation. You know, I am really interested in Ubiquity in a lot of ways. Was written for medical peers to say, hey, colleagues, there's this parallel world that we can explore, and we've been ignoring. You know, exceptionalisms are all bad. They're all blindfolds, and human exceptionalism, our field is kind of entrenched in hundreds of centuries of anthropocentrism. So I've started these conferences in 2011 called Ubiquity Conferences, bringing together veterinary schools and medical schools, physicians and veterinarians. We do cancer, heart disease, we also do behavior cases, bullying we've done, etc. We've done a fair amount on eating disorders, self-injury in human and non-human animals. So if any of you are interested, I love to collaborate, and just email me. And some of the video I have, I'm happy to share. I have some of the papers I mentioned today, I'm happy to share as well.
Well, I thank you very much for spending an hour of your time with us this evening. And I'll turn it back over to Mario, I think, to end our evening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Irwin and Dr. Horowitz. Such a great conversation. We truly appreciate your time and for joining us this evening. And thank you all for listening and tuning in. And again, if you have any suggestions for future authors, please email alumni@ucsf.edu. This is our first and hopefully a long series of conversations with alumni authors. I do want to highlight 3 upcoming events that we have. So tomorrow, if you are available at 10:30 a.m. in partnership with the Benioff Children's Hospital team, we have a program titled How to Talk to Your Kids About Race and Racism. Next week, we have 2 events. On September 22nd from noon to 1 on National Voters Day, we are hosting an Advocacy 101 with our Government and Community Relations Office. And on September 23rd, so that's next Wednesday from noon to 1:30, we have a panel discussing the future of telehealth. It's called Looking Past COVID-19, Will Telehealth Endure? If you can't attend any of these because of the time, I'd recommend just going ahead and registering so that you are sure to get the recording so you can watch it at a later time. Thank you so much again, and I hope everyone has a terrific evening.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.